I landed on Madagascar's eastern shore in 1826 as one of 4 French missionaries and 2 Malagasy guides, intent on founding a chapel and tending the sick. Before the dry season had properly begun, on a rain-dark night, a presence crossed our camp, a moving absence of light that silenced the jungle and refused any explanation. We came ashore from a small bark, her deck slick with spray and the dull iron of anchors, the wind set from the east. I had kept a ledger of supplies and sermons since the voyage, the pages already smudged with salt and ink in it. I recorded every bale of trade cloth, every volume of scriptures, the brass compass and sextant brought for coastal reckoning, and the medical chest, whose oils and bandages I meant to offer to any who would receive them. The men of the deck, sailors from Ile Bourbon, helped lower our small boat. 2 Malagasy guides, Andre and Soa, received us in the shallows and took charge of our packages with a practiced economy of motion. With them were the catechist, Rakoto, and my 2 confrères, Père Lucien and Père Moreau. We were 6 in all, plus the 3 hands who ferried our things. The coast was a place of immediate smells: marsh, warmed earth, and the faint, clinging reek of mangrove rot. We bundled ourselves and our implements into a narrow pirogue at first light and pushed upriver. The pirogue rode low in the tannin-dark water, and the paddles chopped the surface in precise, wet beats. The guides knew every bend they could read the river as a sailor reads a chart, feeling eddies with their knees, listening for the murmur of falls beyond the bend. I kept the ledger on my knees, turning pages between strokes, notating the hours and our bearings when the sun allowed Père Lucien handled the compass, its brass casing dulled by ocean spray. And at noon, we used the sextant to take the sun's altitude against the thin grey slice of horizon where river met sky. We disembarked where the current slowed and strangers' tracks were legible upon clay. There the pirogue was lashed, and we proceeded inland by ox cart and by foot, the cart's wheels worrying the red dirt into a powder that clung to boots and hems. The oxen moved with the slow patience of beasts used to heat their bells, chimed a steady, low ecclesiastical rhythm that might have been a hymn, were it not for the sweat and flies. The guides led us by paths woven through cane and spreading palms, pausing now and then to set a hand upon the bole of a tree and to whisper a name or a warning in Malagasy. I saw more than once that they exchanged looks with Rakoto, the catechist, when the forest swallowed a sound, an owl's wing perhaps, or the sudden stasis of bird flesh falling silent, and their faces tightened as if the country held its breath. We kept to a schedule of prayer and labor. Each morning we cleared ground for the chapel, laid out timbers where the cart could pass, unloaded the medicines and spread them under tarpaulins, counting bandages aloud in the light. Evenings were for instruction and the catalogue of need: a woman with a swollen leg, a child with fever, a man whose teeth had been eaten by rot. We ate simply, rice, smoked fish, with our hands, sharing the work of mending nets and sewing torn cloth. In the privacy of my journal, I wrote of sermons planned, of sermons given, and of the steady, creeping exhaustion that attends such work in heat and in the company of flies. Rain began to press upon us like a thought. The nights stayed dense, and close clouds sat low over the canopy, and the air tasted of iron before a storm. On the 3rd evening after we set camp inland, thunder muttered beyond the hills. We raised a shelter of canvas and cut branches to lay a curb around the fire to keep it from pooling in mud. The brass compass had been checked again and again, its needle true to the murdered noon, and the sextant packed away lest humidity steal its vernier. Still, small dislocations occurred. A rope frayed where it had not frayed the day before. A tin lid found askew, though we knew we had fastened it. The dogs restless, though they had slept without complaint. I remember a moment before nightfall when Andri and Soa stood at the camp's edge and pointed inland, their faces darkened with rain and with something that was not merely the weather. They spoke together in low tones, words I did not yet understand in full. Rakoto translated a phrase that trembled in his mouth and then was swallowed, that the forest had shifted its eyes. Père Moreau made the sign of the cross without thinking, and even the oxen seemed to lean away from the deeper woods. We brightened the fire, checked the instruments, counted our candles and our flasks, and I set my ledger beneath a folded coat to shelter it from damp. Night came with the slow certainty of a door closing. The jungle redoubled its sounds, a rain darkness gathered. We did not know then what passed our camp, only that the world went suddenly quieter, and that silence felt like the first uneven page of a story we had not the means to read. As the country turned quickly to dense littoral forest and swamp, the air lay thick with humidity, mosquitoes and the distant calls of lemurs and nocturnal birds. Each night the lanterns felt fragile in the press of leaf and mist. Local elders we consulted offered polite cautionary tales, not of demons, but of a shadow that sometimes went between trees and put out lamps, which made us tighten our watch, but did not deter our work. We pressed eastward from the strand at dawn, our charts marked in a neat hand, the chronometer set by noon on board, a compass for close work, and a sextant for the coast. Our stores were simple: salted meat, rice, bottles of brandy, tins of whale oil for the lanterns, spare wicks, tarred rope, and a pair of machetes. We made camp upon a raised hummock where the ground dried beneath our canvas. We hammered pegs, set mosquito netting, and by lamplight took bearings and wrote in the journal. The men spoke little. When the small flame guttered, we checked the wick, sucked at the nozzle, smelled the oil, and found nothing amiss. Yet 2 nights after our arrival, the lamps went out in the same manner. No wind, no rain, no hand that I could discern the light simply failed, and the shadow seemed to come from no quarter at all. Once I stepped toward the trees with my lamp held high, Father Moreau at my elbow, when the flame eased, drew in, and died as if a hand had passed between it and the wick. We discovered no trace of soot or smoke, no greasy residue, the glass bore no mark. What remained was a pocket of chill air, damp and sweet with crushed leaf, and a silence in which the lemurs fell away as though embarrassed. The elders watched and said little, but at night, one of them, Rakoto, who had guided us thus far, refused to sleep where the trail pressed near the mangroves. He sat among sacks of provisions, his head bent, and marked his palm with a carved bone charm. We doubled the watch, wound extra lens with oil, and fastened the lamps behind glass cages. Still 2 more lights died within a week. On the 3rd occasion, Father Moreau took up a musket, fired an empty field shot into the understory, and the sound ricocheted among trunks without answer. At dawn, we found the needles of compass steady, the chronometer keeping its minute, and upon the bark of a large tree, a set of scratches ran finger-high, parallel and too regular for a brute. The wood bore no blood, no hair. The men argued of wind and of the failure of lamps. while I wrote slowly, knowing that a rational account must precede any superstition. Yet, beside the measurements and the trivial comforts of brandy, a different ledger grew. Pockets of shadow, where the light would not hold a sense as of something moving not with limb, but by absence, and men whose voices tightened at trivial matters. I slept little, waking to the rasp of insects and the distant slap of water on bark, and each morning made fast the journals, measured the stretch walked, and set a course for the next cairn. The shadow did not yet take form. It preferred to taste our lamps, to mark us by the failure of light and the cool pockets where even breath seemed to falter. We did not flee. We tightened stores, counted munitions, and made an inventory in case we should need to leave in haste. At dusk, I stood with Father Moreau at the edge of camp, the glow of our last lamps reflected in the wet feet of mangroves, and something in the understory slid between trunks and took the light as if drawing breath. We exchanged a look, and in that look, the expedition's purpose and our fragile certainty met. We moved. I had ordered the party eastward before dawn, for the eastern coast lay beyond the low ridges, and I wished us at the strand by nightfall. We moved with the measured economy of men who knew the value of powder and bread, a half jar of biscuit, tins of salted pork, a keg of rum, flint and spare priming, 2 oil lanterns tucked into the shoulder of the procession. Father Laurent held the chart between his knees. The catechist Jean watched the trail, and I carried the brass compass my brother had given me when I took holy orders. The light grew thin, and the forest closed by the second hour. Small things began to gather about us. Jean's voice came low, sharp. He had found a line of crushed plantain leaves that led like a deliberate footpath to a clearing. We followed, lanterns in hand, and there, half buried in the clay, lay a spear of indigenous make, long-hafted, head of tempered iron, its shaft bent through some force that had not been human. Mud smeared its length as though something had dragged it. No prints were near it, save those we later found in the morning. We took the spear up and felt the grain of the wood, the slight sticky residue of sap, and an impression as if whatever bent it had been heavy and not careful with tools. That night, our oil lanterns would gutter though no wind touched them. The flame narrowed to a thread, flared, then went soft as a sigh. After a breath, the glass cleared, and the wick burned full again, all while the air hung utterly still. We tested the lanterns, trimmed wicks, refilled oil, and yet the phenomenon persisted. Father Laurent crossed himself and murmured a psalm. The men tightened belts and set extra tinder within reach. We slept in a ring with muskets at our feet, muzzle-loading pieces, flintlocks with frayed cord slings, powder horns under pillows, cartridge paper tucked away. There was a nightly economy to our fear. Checks of priming, slow ritual loading of locks, the clink of a ramrod in the dark. On the morning after the lanterns first faltered, there were prints in the clay twice the length of a man's foot. They were not the neat, regular impressions of Malagasy sandals, nor the clawed marks of a known beast. They were elongated ovals, the heel and toe indistinct, as if the foot had been wrapped in some broad pad. I stooped and held my palm above one. There was no ordinary human odor of sweat or tobacco or cooked meat. The men sniffed and shook their heads. Jean tasted the dampness of the clay and declared it had not been a man's tread in any language he knew. It struck me as unaccountable that the earth should hold shape without scent. My compass once trembled and swung on its card as though seeking. I set it upon a stump to confirm my reading, and watched, uneasy, as the needle twitched with a life of its own until it described a slow circle and then stilled, pointing inland, away from the coast we had so diligently sought. I touched the brass rim. It was cool and true, though the needle's movement had an insistence I could not explain. The men spoke in low voices and kept their muskets cleaner and nearer than before. There were long looks sent into the trees where little noises, branches touching, distant calls of birds, took on the weight of warning. We altered our course as prudence demanded, and yet kept the hope of the sea inside us like a flint. We made a second clearing by a half-ruined kapok tree and set a watch. At midnight, beyond the ring of our fire, something moved with a sound like cloth through leaves. It was neither the tearing cry of fossa nor the chatter of lemur. Father Laurent rose, clutched his rosary, Jean shouldered his spear, and we held our breath as a darker absence slipped between trunks, not pursuing but watching us. One night, about the third week in camp, I saw it plainly. Not an animal, but a great, lean shadow sliding between the trunks beneath a silvered moon, taller than any man and moving without sound. Blotting the lantern light as it passed, it had no face, only an edge that rippled like heavy cloth. I remember the small particulars as if they were instruments on a table, the hiss of our oil lanterns in their brass cages, the raw taste of iron and salted meat on my tongue. The damp of moss climbed onto my boots. The catechist stumbled backward, his broad-brimmed hat nearly leaving his head. His face went white in the lamplight. For an instant, he could say nothing but prayer. A shot went off. The report came from the Fusilier silex pressed against the short wooden fence we had made about the fires. The recoil bit into the shoulder of the man who fired the flash of the pan, through his features gaunt and severe for a single second. The lead found only leaves. No shape was marked by ball or flame, and for a long minute the forest kept its breath. We moved then as men who had been given leave to act without counsel. I dragged a heavier lantern from the tent and checked the priming of my own musket. Our stores lay under canvas: salted pork, ship biscuits in tins, a small iron kettle, a compass that had not yet been returned to its case since our inland march. The catechist, always more steady in prayer than in arms, kept his rosary clenched and whispered the names of saints as if their syllables might be measured against the thing we had seen. The native porters would not meet one another's eyes. Their hands went to their cutlasses and to the crude clubs they carried for clearing the path. We followed the shadow's direction, keeping to the line of trunks where the moon made patches of white upon leaves. The undergrowth showed the scrape of feet where we had not expected them. Branches were swifter to recover their place than any animal's trail. At times, the ground was so sodden with last night's rain that our boots sank, bringing up the sick sweet of rot and the smell of iron mud. No spoor presented itself, no distinct foot, no fur caught upon a thorn. The leaves lay ruffled as if a great cloak had been drawn through them. Once, at the edge of a marsh where the roots spread like the fingers of an old hand, the shadow flicked again. It did not cross openly, but seemed to lean along the line of trees, as if to test the light. This time, 3 of us fired in quick succession. The second shot threw such a noise that birds rose in wild confusion and swept the dark in flurries. Even so, the air held no cry of pain. Where the bullets had struck the soft earth, the water rose in small blind bubbles and then closed as if it had never been disturbed. We then fell back toward the fires, our lamps ragged and guttering from the damp. One of the porters was missing. He had been beside the kettle not a quarter hour before, speaking in low Malagasy with the guide about the morrow's rationing. When we returned to the place he had occupied, there was nothing but the print of his knees in the mud and a scattering of burnt tobacco leaves where he had lain. We found no blood, only the impression of a hasty retreat, and his remaining kit, an empty calabash and a strip of linen, lay folded upon a low root. We argued furiously in the cold of that lantern circle. The catechist called for a hymn to be sung for the missing man. The guide swore that robbers would not take a man thus, for they would carry off his goods. I began, in a voice I did not recognize as mine, to speak of sensible things, to post watch in relays, to bury the masks and tinctures we kept against fever, to reduce the fires and make the evening appear as routine as possible. Still none of us could deny the impression left upon us, the way the dark had cut the lantern light as a cloth might cut a candle flame. By dawn, we had strengthened the watches. We set the men 2 to an hour. The catechist insisted upon standing a watch himself, though he had not slept for the better half of the night. We marked the boundary of the camp more plainly with cleared earth and with sharpened stakes. In daylight, the forest yielded its ordinary forms: vine, liana, the leaf brown that had been the same since the world began. Yet even in the sun, one could see where the shadows lay longer, as if the place where the thing had passed remembered it. We did not find the porter. The missing kit, the closed water, the rippled edge of leaves remained the only proofs. When at last we struck the tents and took the first steps toward the eastern coast, there was between us a reserve I had not known before. We moved with measured speed and with more lanterns than prudent men should require. No one spoke of turning back. No one could say whether to press forward was wiser than to retreat. I could only set my hand upon my musket and tell my men the next orders, as if the next act depended upon nothing but seamanship and the map. Yet each time I looked at the line of trees that receded behind us, I felt the same impression, that whatever had crossed our path had not been content to remain a single passing, but had left an insistence in the wood which we would answer, or which would answer us when night returned. We withdrew that week to the coast, and eventually to a different mission site. The jungle behind us seemed to close with each day, its breath a moist, green pressure on our shoulders. Our cartwheels sank in red soil. Our tents were patched with sailcloth. The sextant lay in its wooden case, alongside a small inkstand and the ledger in which I kept my account. Our guides, who had led us through mangrove and termite mound, had begun to speak more quietly of the inland woods, glancing where once they had walked with ease. They carried their hatchets and the long knives of their people. We kept our muskets locked and our powder in oilskin, for we had enough hardship to teach prudence. On the night in question, the air cooled toward evening, and a wet wind came off the ocean. We made a small camp beneath a stand of low palms near a rivulet that stank faintly of brine and decay. The men set a fire of driftwood and braided reed. Father Lemaire read a short office by lampglass light, while the guides tied fresh cord to the canoe. We kept to our usual routine: supper, the checking of flints and cartridges, the counting of instruments, the writing of names into the register. But there was an odd stillness in the leaves, as if something had halted its breathing to listen. Shortly after I had put down my pen, I heard a sound that was neither animal nor wind. It began as a rubbing, a scraping across the undergrowth, close but not quite among us, the sort of noise that draws the skin tight along the arms. Our guide, Rakoto, stiffened, his hand to the haft of his knife. Pierre and Antoine, the two lay brothers assigned to night watches, rose together and moved to the edge of lamplight. I walked with them. The lantern threw a circle, and beyond it a blackness seemed to thicken, as if the darkness itself had been gathered and pressed. From that blackness there came a shape. It was not formed by muscle or fur, it was a thing of absence and suggestion, taller than a man but without contour. When it moved, the light at the fire bent away, the shadows in our faces leaned into it. There was no figure to mark with bayonet or rope. It glided with a soft sound like cloth drawn over dry leaves. Pierre spoke the Lord's Prayer aloud, as if the words might bind it, and Antoine made the sign of the cross until his fingers trembled. We fired a shot from a musket to make it break its course. The report cracked, and the night answered with 1,000 small noises. But the thing did not flee as a beast flees. Instead, it seemed to react as a thing of weather might. There was a pressure in the air and a cold that seeped through wool and skin. Rakoto stepped forward with his knife lifted and then stopped, his eyes wet and unseeing. He later told me he had seen no face, only a gulf that looked back. When the shadow drew closer to our circle, the youngest of the guides let out a low cry and fled into the mangrove, stumbling and disappearing in a tangle of roots. The canoe was pushed off hurriedly, and the men slipped their paddles into the water. We did not pursue. Our duty as missionaries is to charity, and to witness that night our charity was for ourselves. We took what we could carry: Bibles, the ledger, 2 blankets, and left behind a pot, some sacks of rice, and our dignity. At dawn, we reached the coast, hands raw from paddles, the smell of salt in our mouths, masking the sweeter rot of the forest. We made for another mission site farther along the strand, a hamlet where a priest had offered shelter. 2 men would not sleep by themselves thereafter. Pierre and Antoine would not lie in a tent alone for months. They kept to each other as though joined by an invisible cord. Rakoto would not go into the thicket after dark, and the other guides cast the wood's name in softer tones, as if the thing there were a presence to be propitiated. I recorded the incident in the mission ledger because it altered how we moved and how the Malagasy guides spoke of the woods. The encounter answered nothing, but left a clear imprint on our party. A recorded night in 1826, when a French missionary band met a shadow in Madagascar, a story retold in parish records and by villagers whose warnings we had once lightly taken. In the years that followed, the ledger became for them a writing of warning. For me, it remained an open page. We had escaped with our lives and without a wound to show, and so the mystery persisted. What was taken from that night, and what, if anything, had been left in the dark behind us?